The boy sat quietly in his wheelchair, his small hands gripping the armrests as he waited outside the store. He had done nothing wrong, just minding his own business, when the cop walked up sneering. "What are you doing here, kid?" The officer's voice dripped with condescension, his eyes filled with judgment. The boy didn't answer right away, but that only seemed to make the cop more impatient. "You think that chair gives you special treatment?" The officer chuckled, shaking his head. People passed by, some glancing, others ignoring the situation entirely. But before the boy could respond, a black SUV screeched to a stop just feet away. The door flew open, and a tall man in a dark suit stepped out, his sharp gaze locked onto the officer. "Step away from my son." His voice was calm, controlled, but behind it was something cold, something dangerous. The officer's smirk faded instantly. The officer took a step back, his eyes darting between the boy and the man who had just arrived. There was something about the way the man carried himself, steady, unshaken, that made the officer hesitate. "Sir, I was just..." the cop started, but the man cut him off with a slow shake of his head. "You were just what?" His voice remained even, but there was a quiet authority behind it. He took another step forward, his presence commanding attention. The badge clipped to his belt gleamed under the streetlights. FBI. The officer swallowed hard. "I didn't mean any harm, I just..." The man turned his gaze to his son, his expression softening for the briefest moment. "You okay?" The boy nodded, but there was something in his eyes, something unspoken. The father turned back to the officer, his expression unreadable. "Then tell me exactly what you were doing." The officer shifted on his feet, his confidence cracking under the weight of the FBI agent's stare. "Look, it was just a misunderstanding," he muttered, forcing a casual shrug. "I was just making sure everything was in order." The father didn't blink. "Everything was in order," he replied. "Except you singled out my son. Why?" The officer opened his mouth, then hesitated. The street felt quieter now, as if the air itself was holding its breath. A few people had stopped to watch, sensing something deeper unfolding. The boy stayed silent, his fingers gripping the armrest of his wheelchair tighter. He wasn't scared. He had learned not to be, but there was something unsettling about how fast everything had changed. Moments ago, he was invisible. Now, all eyes were on him. "I didn't mean anything by it," the cop finally said. The father tilted his head slightly. "That's not good enough." The officer's jaw tightened, his hand twitching near his belt, as if searching for control. His uniform, his badge, none of it seemed to carry the weight it had just minutes ago. The FBI agent, standing firm, wasn't backing down. "I'll ask you again," the father said, his voice calm but edged with something undeniable. "Why did you approach my son?" The officer exhaled sharply, his frustration slipping through. He looked out of place, he muttered. "Sitting there alone, I thought maybe..." "Maybe what?" The father's tone didn't rise, but the pressure in the air did. The officer didn't answer. The boy finally spoke, his voice steady. "You didn't ask anyone else what they were doing." His words cut through the tension like a knife. The officer's face reddened. The small crowd watching grew larger, quiet but attentive. The weight of the moment hung thick in the air. Then, the father took a slow step forward. The officer stiffened as the father stepped closer, but before he could say anything, a voice cut through the tension. "Agent Carter." The father didn't turn immediately. He recognized the voice. It belonged to someone he hadn't expected to see here, at least not tonight. Slowly, he glanced over his shoulder. A second officer stood a few feet away, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something that said he knew exactly who he was dealing with. The first officer looked between them, confusion flickering across his face. "Wait, you know this guy?" he asked. The second officer nodded, his gaze locked on the agent. "Yeah," he said, voice lower now. "And if I were you, I'd stop talking." The father's jaw clenched. He knew there was more to this than a random encounter. The way the second officer was looking at him, it wasn't just recognition. It was something deeper, something personal. Agent Carter's eyes stayed locked on the second officer, reading between the lines. This wasn't just about his son anymore. There was something bigger at play, something he hadn't seen coming. The first officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his colleague. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice uncertain now. The second officer sighed, then turned to Carter. "You're investigating the precinct, aren't you?" Silence. The tension shifted, thickening in a way that made even the bystanders uneasy. The first officer frowned, but Carter didn't answer. The second officer took that as confirmation. "I thought so," he muttered. "I warned them this would happen." Carter exhaled slowly, realizing the pieces were finally falling into place. This wasn't just about his son being harassed. It was connected to something much deeper, something he had been working on for months. The precinct was under federal investigation, and now they knew he was watching. The first officer paled. "You." He stopped himself, suddenly aware of how much trouble he was in. Carter finally spoke. "This isn't over." And just like that, the weight of the moment shifted. The officer who had mocked his son moments ago now stood frozen, realizing he had picked the worst possible person to mess with. The first officer took a shaky breath, realizing there was nothing he could say to undo what had just happened. His arrogance had blinded him, and now he was standing face to face with the consequences. The small crowd that had gathered began to disperse, whispers filling the air as people glanced back at the scene. Carter knelt beside his son, his expression softening. "Let's go," he said gently. The boy nodded, his grip on the wheelchair loosening. He had seen his father in action before, but this time was different. This time, it was personal. As Carter helped his son toward the car, the second officer stepped closer. "Be careful," he said under his breath. "They won't like being exposed." Carter gave a small nod, already knowing the fight wasn't over. But as he glanced at his son, he knew one thing for sure: no one would ever make him feel small again.